Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Cloud Security Alliance Summit on Regulated Industries. We are delighted to have you here today. This summit is the first of its kind, and it exists really for one very specific reason. Across financial services, healthcare, government, critical infrastructure, telecommunications, and other regulated sectors, we are noticing this widening gap. And this gap is not between innovation and security. It's not even between technology and policy. The gap that we're seeing is this pace of technological change and the speed of regulation to keep up. Our regulatory frameworks over the years were designed for these systems that have really evolved at a slower pace. And today's AI systems are not evolving over many years. They're evolving over months, sometimes weeks, or even days. And our static regulation is increasingly trying to govern these very dynamic systems. So the challenge we have is trying to keep pace with both what is expected of us as well as the risk that we see in the innovation of Mythos and OpenAI's GPT 5.6 and all these cyber models that are able to identify quickly vulnerabilities and then weaponize them in a matter of hours or days compared to the footprinting and all the complexity that used to happen with these cyber risks. So the challenge is exactly why we created this summit. It's not simply to discuss compliance, but it's to explore what trustworthy governance is going to look like in the future in this era of autonomous agents and continually evolving AI. So as we enter this era, we don't have to think or speculate, I should say, about where regulated industry is headed. Our recent survey report, hopefully you saw it last month, the state of cloud and AI for financial services. We do this every 3 years. This is the third time in 2026. And it shows us that really the future of AI adoption is already here. The report found that 62% of financial institutions or respondents had already deployed AI agents in their environment. And among them, the vast majority had granted those agents some level of autonomous decision making. And even more striking, 85% expect that AI agents are going to initiate and execute financial transactions. We've already seen this with Visa and BBVA demonstrating live successful agentic payments being done on behalf of a consumer. So while most are believing that this is going to happen and will become mainstream commerce, there is a reality also. 65% of them said that there is a new authorization, some new form of governance is going to be required. Now, when I think about what that means, it means for the first time, regulated industry is moving beyond the software that merely assists people, and it's deploying systems that increasingly act like a person. And that's why I'm so pleased to have Josh Woodruff and his donation of his agentic trust framework for AI agents, and really starting to assign these roles of treating agents like a person and qualifying their capabilities based on their actions. Hopefully you get a chance to look at the ATF. The shift with regulatory expectations, though, is really challenging our security, our governance, the accountability, and even the compliance conversation. For those that don't know my background, I've been involved in standards development for nearly 30 years and helped to create the PCI data security standard and several of the payment standards that are associated with PCI. And you'll hear more about this on a panel later today as we start to dive into these expectations. But many years ago when we created PCI, there was this from long-standing standards developers, why were we doing revisions on a 3-year life cycle? That was far too fast. And now, I think with the systems we have today, that's far too slow. So we're going to see that there's going to be this transition for all kinds of compliance and what that means for our frameworks as well. Which brings us really to I think, the central question, or maybe the theme of today's summit, which is if AI agents are able to make decisions continuously, if the infrastructure is constantly changing, and the risk along with that is constantly changing, then why do we have so many of our governance models still operating on periodical cycles? We need to find ways that we can enter this new era of cybersecurity governance and trustworthiness in a way that we are comfortable with all the assurance that's in place. That is, when we look at the cybersecurity frameworks of the past, I want to say that the first generation was really about protecting infrastructure and confident that the physical security and access to our assets was protected. And then we moved into this era of the internet and securing the cloud, and then recognizing these peripheral boundaries was not necessarily the end all to be all, and we started to embrace zero trust. But I think with this next generation of governance, we're going to see a lot more around autonomous intelligence. And that means that we need to move beyond these static controls, beyond our annual audits, beyond the documentation that seems to be stale before it's even published, and move towards this era of continuous assurance, continuous runtime governance, behavioral analytics, policy-aware AI, and other types of advanced testing that we are doing within our own networks. I think that compliance is really going to change how it's being measured. In fact, if you had an opportunity to read our paper on Mythos and preparing for this AI storm, that was one of the central talking points that I took away, was the security metrics that we're using, the KPIs that have become accustomed for boardrooms to hear, I think are going to need to be measured differently. And that really is the vision behind our compliance automation revolution. You're going to hear today from Daniele Catadou, who will give you an update on the CAR program and what we've been doing. I'm very excited about what that means in the next version and expectations. And you're going to also see that reflected in the talk by Anthropic's Josh Johnson and the work he is doing to embed regulatory awareness directly into the AI models themselves to help with classifying the type of data, the type of activity, whether or not it's going to meet governance expectations. And you also, you can see it reflected in the governance efforts we have with AARM. So that is our autonomous action runtime management that was donated to us by Vanta and others, where policy enforcement starts to move into this execution layer itself within memory, which I think is incredibly important. And it's also reflected in all of the work we're doing in our CSA labs. If you're not familiar, we're doing quite a bit with MCP and some of the authenticity and integrity of that protocol and similar types of agentic communication. If you go to labs.cloudsecurityalliance.org, you'll see more about that. And we're building some of these really practical capabilities into our governance models. My hope is that throughout today, when we end today's summit, we are simply not looking at just a conversation on what is the best model to comply with. It seems like we are our standard model to comply with, because it seems that we are increasingly building more and more standards. That's the easy part. The hard part is actually executing and having good ongoing practical due diligence of adhering to and having the discipline to adhere to these types of activities. So you're going to hear a lot more throughout the day, but I do hope that you are checking back in with CSA, looking at the telemetry work that we're doing, building out new types of data that I think will really resonate with the industry, and help to start to define a new type of regulation. More importantly, one that is built around continuous trust that will sustain us throughout this age of autonomous AI. And with that, I will thank you for attending today's summit on regulated industry and hope you enjoy the rest of the day.